Hello, Holy Hannah. Can you believe it? Today is our very last lecture of psychology. I do apologize for getting this one to you a little bit later. I was over at the school all day yesterday helping with distribution and stuff, so I didn't have a chance to kind of get my head start on this lecture. So hopefully you have enjoyed the course thus far. I look forward to working with many of you in AP Psychology next year. I'm also teaching the 12th grade econ course, so I might have some of you there. With that kind of in mind, I just am so excited. I look forward to being back at school in person, being able to engage and talk with you. I know I saw a couple of you maybe yesterday at yearbook pickup, and I was like, I think that person's in my class, but I don't really know anybody. So thank you for bearing with me this semester, or I guess it's just been this term, but thank you for bearing with me and working hard and getting all your stuff done. If you need anything from me moving forward, or if you have questions about AP Psychology and what that might look like, feel free to shoot me an email. I would love to talk with you. And then, just take a look at your grades if there's anything that you're missing, or if you need anything from me. Again, email me. This is the last lecture. You do have a formative check after this just to make sure all the memory stuff is clear for you. And then your FRQ you can take either tomorrow or on Thursday, whichever works best for you. It'll be available and open from 8:20 to 3:10 both days. So you do you, whatever's best for you. It's beautiful outside today, and I'm hoping we get some thunderstorms because I love thunderstorms. But that'll be later. Anyway, today we're talking about retrieval and forgetting. I got a few videos for you embedded within this to make it a little bit more interesting. But yeah. Happy last lecture. So here we go. Let's cruise through some of these ideas, as you do have a formative to get to, so I'm going to try and keep this one pretty concise. Retrieval, as we are learning about it, is going to be pretty self-explanatory, because this is what we know of when we are talking about memory. This is how we're actually articulating things. This is how we're actually pulling ideas out of our brain and using them to answer test questions or refer to a story that happened to us in the past, whatever. So retrieval is kind of what we know of memory, and then we'll talk just briefly about forgetting. But we're going to start here with this little graphic again. Yesterday we talked about encoding and we talked about storage. We looked at all of these different kind of components of storage, and today we will be looking at the retrieval process, right? How do we get that light bulb? How do we remember things and pull those things out of our brains and actually remember them? And then the last piece of the puzzle we are going to talk about is forgetting, and why do we forget things? And it's really important to recognize that forgetting things happens, or there's a failure that could occur with the encoding process, with the storage process, or with the retrieval process. So a failure at any of these kind of stages of memory could lead us to forget content or whatever it is we're trying to remember. So a little bit of review here. Obviously, this is pretty wordy. We referenced these ideas at the very beginning of yesterday's lecture: recall, recognition, relearning. These are the ways in which we are demonstrating our memory, right? From each of these kind of demonstrations, we know that our storage and recall capacity is virtually unlimited based on research that's been done. We also know that the capacity for recognition is greater than the capacity for recall, right? That's why oftentimes, this is kind of a blanket statement. Generally speaking, a multiple choice test can be easier than a fill in the blank test, because you see the potential options. Now, obviously, there are confounding variables, and people second guess themselves on multiple choice tests and have test anxiety and whatever. So that's a very blanket statement. Don't come at me. But generally speaking, being able to recognize the answer versus recalling it and actually pulling that definition or term from your memory is easier and we have a greater capacity for it. And then the last piece here, relearning, we know that this can highlight the memories are, even if, okay, so relearning honestly is going to highlight that memories are there even if we can't recall forming them, right? Because we maybe forgot something, but when we go back and try to relearn it, it goes quicker, meaning like our brain has it somewhere. It just, we can't recall that information. So just kind of an example as we're pertaining to relearning. I want you to think about, like, what is this object? Can you tell? What is the object? Even though it's obscured by 6 layers of scribbles, some of you glanced on the first slide of this PowerPoint or this lecture, you may recognize what this is, right? Now, if I gave you a multiple choice potential, you would be far more likely to be able to say, like, that object is blank than if I'm asking you to recall it, right? Let's see real quick. Now, can you tell what it is? How about now? Now? Weird. Well, I don't know why that didn't. It was supposed to progress and ultimately show you just, it's a log, like it's a tree stump that's cut in half. And this was on the very first slide of this PowerPoint. So some of you maybe recognize, like, that's weird, why is that there? And you realized what it was and you were able to recall that. Maybe some of you didn't recognize it. But if I were to have given you a multiple choice potential, it would have been a lot easier for you to reference what the object in fact was. So as we're looking kind of at the next piece of the puzzle, right, you have recognition, recall, and relearning, right? That's where we're at as it pertains to retrieval. We know that all of these are components of how we remember things, right? We can see in implicit memory, as well as our talent for recognizing faces that we don't consciously recall, we may not be aware of all that we have in our memory, right? Another sign of this subconscious memory is the demonstrated change in our ability to relearn material. If we can learn the material more easily the second time, we must have preserved some sort of that memory, right? Oh, hey, so looking at the relearning process, here you have a graph that shows basically that the more times somebody rehearses out loud, the less time somebody needs to relearn or rememorize the same letters on day 2, right? So this is just a research study that was done, and Ebbinghaus actually studied, like, the memorization of nonsense syllables, so THB, YOX, KVU, EHM, and so people learned them the first day, and it took them X amount of time to memorize them. Then the next day, it took them less time, and then the next day, it took them less time, proving that, like, the memory is still there, we just can't recall it, right? So some questions that this type of research poses, to think back and connect back to what we talked about yesterday. What type of processing was Ebbinghaus doing, right? What are we looking at here? This is an example, right, of effortful processing. Remember that term. The next question, what does this show us about the best way to memorize, right? We know repetition is useful. So when you're studying for a test or when you're studying for whatever it is you're studying for, right, the more often you do it, right, remember the spacing effect and the timing effect from yesterday, or the testing effect, right, those are all ways to help you better study, right? So there you have relearning. And it's also important, big picture, to recognize that retrieval cues are important to our ability to, like, pull information out of our brain. We know that memory involves a web of associated concepts, right? It's not just like a filing cabinet where you can, like, alphabetically say, like, how to ride a bike, like a Google search, and, like, your brain files that away. Like, there's a bunch of different connections. Like, when did I last ride a bike? What type of bike was it? What was the weather like? Where was I going, right? You have all these different memories that kind of compose or come together to help you remember how to do something like riding a bike, right? We know retrieval is challenging. We know that memory isn't stored in a way that it can be retrieved easily, alphabetically, like I was saying, like a Google search, but instead it's like a web of associations, right? So you see this image here, right? We have conceptual, we have contextual, and we have emotional kind of memories that all combine together to help us remember specific instances. So with that, there are a couple of retrieval cues that we're going to talk about here real quick, different types of memories as it pertains to our understanding. So first thing is priming. Priming triggers a thread of associations that bring us to a concept. Just as a spider feels movement in a web, the following and follows it to find the bug, right? Like, so a little thing is like triggered in our brain, and that web, that constructed web in our brain of memory, makes us think, okay, this is what I'm looking for, right? Our minds work by having no idea, and this maintains the flow of thought. So I want you to define the word bark in your head. What is the word bark? Most of you probably said like the outer layer of a tree. What if I did this, right? Now, what would you say the definition of the word bark is, right? The sound a dog makes, right? And so because I primed you with the image of the tree first and then the image of the dog, right, that triggered something in your brain that was like, oh, tree, bark, bark outside of a tree. It didn't make you think like, oh, tree bark is the sound a dog makes, right? That doesn't make sense. So priming is actually a really powerful tool, and it's been studied in pretty significant detail throughout psychology and throughout our understanding of what is memory. So one thing to note is that priming has been called the invisible memory because it affects us unconsciously. If you remember back, we talked a little bit about like illusions, and we talked about like, oh no, what is it called? Oh my gosh. Subliminal messaging. Whoa, that. Ooh, the light bulb. But when we're talking about like the case of the tree bark versus dog bark, the path we follow within our brain can be channeled by that priming. So they've done a bunch of studies, and one of the studies said that people primed with money-related words were less likely to help other people. So they would like prime them with a bunch of different money-related words, and then they'd like have somebody walk by and drop all their books, and the people who had the money-related words wouldn't help that person because it wasn't something that was going to achieve or get them like a monetary accolade of any sort, right? Whereas people who didn't get those money primers were willing to help because it was more about helping somebody and doing the right thing than it was about making money, right? They've also done studies that say that priming with an image of Santa Claus led kids to share more candy. So if they were shown a picture of Santa Claus versus somebody else, they would share more candy because Christmas is a time of giving for many children who practice Christianity, and even those who maybe don't and just know who Santa Claus is and kind of participate in maybe that cultural norm. Not everybody does, but those who do are seen to share more candy. And then the last one here, people primed with a missing child poster, then misinterpreted ambiguous adult-child interactions as kidnapping. So if they were shown like a missing person's picture versus just like a normal picture of a child, and then they saw like something going on between an adult and a child, they would think that was a kidnapping more quickly because their brain was primed to think that way. So these are just examples of priming, and it again ties back to our understanding of retrieval cues. How are we retrieving vocab? Define bark. How are we retrieving our interpretation of a situation? If it was a missing child, I might think this is a kidnapping, right? Priming is extremely powerful. And again, that invisible memory piece, it's unconscious. We don't necessarily know that it's happening. So with that idea of priming, we also have two types of memories that we're going to look at here. We have context-dependent memories and we have state-dependent memories. Context-dependent memories say that you're more likely to remember things in the same context that you learned them in. So if you're taught words underwater, you're more likely to remember those words when you're underwater. You can see this graph right here. at how much more often people are able to like make those connections when they're in the context that they were in when they learned them. Oftentimes people say that context dependent memory, like kids will want to sit in the same exact seat that they were in for the entirety of the class. I know like some teachers move people around in regards to, like on test day, we're going to sit alphabetically so you're not by your friends or whatever. But kids sometimes want to sit in their same seat because of this context-dependent memory. If you learned it in that seat, you're more likely to remember it in that seat. We retrieve a memory more easily when in the same context as when we form the memory, right? So, question, did you forget a psychology concept? Just sitting down and opening your book might bring the memory back, right? Not because you read it in the book, but because that's what you were doing when you learned it. Maybe you studied one of these units outside because it was nice out, and then you came inside to take the FRQ, right? And you couldn't remember certain things. Moving outside might jaunt your memory, okay? The second piece of this then is going to be state-dependent memories. So you see in this like kind of cartoon over here, I wonder if you'd mind giving me directions. I've never been sober in this part of town before, right? People, if they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol and they learn something, or they, in this example, right, maybe they go to a bar in that area quite often, and so they know their way home from that bar when they've been drinking, but when they go there sober, they might forget their way because of this idea of state-dependent memory, right? Our memories are not just linked to the external context, but also the emotional state we were in when we formed the memory, right? An even deeper kind of branch of a state-dependent memory is going to be a mood-congruent memory. This refers to the tendency to selectively recall details that are consistent with one's current mood, right? If you're angry, you're going to remember like negative things that maybe made you angry in the past, right? You're going to be more likely to remember those things than like if you're really happy, you might forget about all the icky things and you might remember the more positive things that have been going on, right? This biased memory then reinforces our current mood, right? We forget about the bad things, we continue to look at the good things, we continue to feel happy, right? So you have context-dependent and state-dependent memories. And then the last piece of these retrieval cues, and kind of our last kind of conversation about retrieval in and of itself, is the serial position effect. This has been studied a ton. We're actually going to watch just a brief video of an experiment that has been done to kind of reference the primacy effect. But basically this refers to the tendency that when learning information in a long list, we are more likely to recall the first items and the last items. That's why people say, like, if you're auditioning for a role on Broadway, it's better to go first or to go last, right? Because those are more memorable just in and of themselves. So when we look at this graph, you can see the blue line here, right? If you're called back like a certain amount of time after remembering a list of words, right, you're more likely to remember those first words, right? Whereas in this red line, right here, that immediate recall, you're more likely to remember the words that were said last, right? So if I say, okay, memorize this list of words, and I ask you right away, which ones do you remember? You're probably going to remember the last words. But if I call you back and I say, hey, this is like 15 minutes later, I'm like, hey, can you tell me what words you remember? You're more likely to then remember, again, these first few words here. So that's the serial position effect. Like I said, we're going to watch just a quick video about primacy effect, and then we're going to shift our attention to forgetting. So we have covered each of these, right? Encoding, storage, and retrieval. This is the stages of memory, and we are going to again watch that serial position effect, the primacy effect video, and then shift to our understanding of forgetting.
I'd like to know how to be more persuasive, let's say at getting a date or applying for a job. Well, we're about to recreate an experiment described by Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman in his fascinating book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
We've asked a few volunteers to play boss for the day and interview two candidates for the same job.
Play along with our boss and decide which candidate you would hire. Listen carefully. The interviews will go by quickly. Here comes candidate number 1.
Hi.
Hello, I'm Stephanie.
Stephanie, Rico. Pleasure to meet you. Have a seat. Great. So how'd you hear about the company?
Through my school.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'm serious, hardworking, and creative. I'm also moody, nitpicky, and brutally honest.
Okay, that's candidate number 1. What do you think? Okay, now get ready for candidate number 2.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Stacy.
So, here's the key to the experiment. We're using identical twins with identical resumes, which eliminates all the variables except the candidate's own words. Listen closely to candidate number 2. You're gonna have to decide soon which one to hire.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'm brutally honest, nitpicky, and moody. But I'm also creative, hardworking, and serious.
Got it? Let's listen to the most important information one more time so you can make your decision.
I'm serious, hardworking, and creative. I'm also moody, nitpicky, and brutally honest. I'm brutally honest, nitpicky, and moody. But I'm also creative, hardworking, and serious.
So which one would you hire? 1 or 2? Let's see who the interviewer picks.
I would be more prone to go with the first candidate. The first one, my brain, it lit up. The second one had more like a negative vibe.
So, was number 1 your choice? In fact, 80% of the people we ran this experiment on hired applicant number 1.
I think I would go with Stephanie, which would be the first girl that I saw.
The first candidate,
The first candidate, I'd pick the first one.
she seemed to have a more positive outlook.
And there's a reason why.
In this case, the first information you hear stands out, and your brain uses that to color all later information. This is known as the primacy effect.
You probably noticed the girls are using the exact same words, only the order is different.
Serious, hardworking, creative, moody, nitpicky, brutally honest. Brutally honest, nitpicky, moody, creative, hardworking, serious.
And that order makes all the difference. Everybody knows you want to start with your best foot forward, but what's amazing is why. In situations like these, your brain actually starts to shut down after the first word or two. In an effort to take a shortcut, it quickly decides yes or no and doesn't pay much attention to the rest of the information. In test after test, the vast majority of people chose the applicant who started with positive words.
It's amazing that if you just change the order of adjectives, it can completely change the impression the person makes on you.
So there's that primacy effect. We are going to shift our attention to forgetting, and it's important to recognize that forgetting isn't always a bad thing. We referenced neural pruning. I can't remember if that was the bio unit or the developmental unit, but like over time our brain kind of prunes skills and memories and things, knowledge that like we don't need. So I gave the example of like I was in choir in high school. I took all of the music theory classes. I was very good at like sight reading music. And since I haven't done that a lot recently, my brain has kind of pruned that information because it's making way for new information. How do I be a good teacher? How do I engage with kids in e-learning, right? New things that I'm having to engage with. And so just recognize forgetting isn't always a bad thing. We're actually going to watch a video here that looks at a woman. Her name is Jill Price, who cannot forget anything about her own life. It's out of her, she has like an unparalleled autobiographical memory. But when we're thinking about forgetting, it poses the question of like, would it be helpful or beneficial or good to have a brain that stored information like a computer does so that we could easily retrieve any stored item? What would that feel like, right? Would there be any problems? Right? If we remembered everything, maybe we could not prioritize important memories, the things that are most important to us, right? We just had everything in there, right? our wedding day being a more significant date than last Tuesday, right? We might have difficulty thinking abstractly or making connections if our brain was devoted to compiling just isolated bits of information. So with that, there's a few things that could potentially lead to forgetting, right? I referenced that on that chart that I've shown you like 8,000 times in this memory section, that failure can happen at the encoding, storage, or retrieval levels. We can see forgetting being caused by brain damage and encoding failure, storage decay, retrieval failure, any sort of interference, and then there is such thing as motivated forgetting as well. So we are going to just start looking at forgetting as a kind of topic by watching this Good Morning America interview with Jill Price, who has an unbelievable autobiographical memory and remembers everything that has ever happened in her life.
What is it like for most of us to try to remember our lives? Scientists say most of us can remember, 20, 30, 40 emotional events, powerful days in our lives as it goes by. But you're going to meet a woman with a one-of-a-kind memory that allows her to replay her life like a movie, recalling each day in detail, emotional detail. Researchers say it is an autobiographical memory that is simply unmatched. Scientists at the University of California, Irvine have been studying it for 8 years, and she has kept her identity a secret all that time. But now she is ready to talk on GMA and in a new book called The Woman Who Can't Forget. They call her AJ. The subject of most medical studies are usually anonymous. She's a woman with the most amazing memory known to science.
By understanding how her brain does this, we may help write a new chapter of memory research.
It's got to be just like any reference. I mean, you go to the internet, you look in an encyclopedia, or you ask my sister.
AJ remembers details of what she did every single day since she was 14, instantly recalling dates of news events in her lifetime.
She has the ability in a split second to tell you dates, times, what she was doing, what we were doing, what was happening in history. It's hard to describe.
For her, being able to forget isn't easy. She became a fascination around the world, the human calendar, doctors, journalists wanting to meet her, her voice heard on the radio just once.
If I'm able to cure a disease, it's a gift. But to remember like the end of every relationship or, anything, it's hard. But it has formed who I am because I remember everything.
Until now, she's been anonymous, dealing with the interest in her brain, her life, almost too much for her to bear.
She chose not to reveal herself to the world for several years. You can imagine it yourself. If suddenly the whole world knows about you, there's a lot of people out there.
And we are joined now by AJ, who is really Jill Price. We're saying it on television. A 42-year-old school administrator from Los Angeles. And as I said, it is her first ever live appearance on television. And we had a chance to sit down earlier and do a taped interview. Good morning. Good morning. To you again. Can I throw some more questions? Sure. I love that you don't mind that we keep testing this way. All right. I know television is one of the things that you remember what you saw on television on the days in your lives. So when was JR shot on Dallas?
When he was shot, or when did you find out he was shot? Who shot him? He was shot on March 21st, 1980, and we found out November 21st, 1980.
What about the end of All in the Family?
Well, that was in March of 1978.
What about Nancy Kerrigan attacked? Something that interested you?
January 6th, 1994.
Oh, Lord, you're right. The LA riots.
They started on April 29th, 1992.
Unabomber arrested? Ted Kaczynski arrested?
April 3rd or 4th, 1996.
April 4th, yeah. 1996. And you will see tonight, I'm reading from the book. I take this book and go through it, and you correct the book, and you are right at times. I think I have you, and you are right.
And I told you that.
I know you told me, you warned me, but I didn't believe you. And a lot of people didn't at first, including the scientists, when they first met you. They were astonished too. Let's talk a little bit about what it is to be inside your brain, because I am trying to imagine, most of us cannot, what it is to have your history playing in your brain at the same time you're living in the present tense. Describe it.
Well, like right now, I'm in the present moment talking to you, but I have a split screen in my head where I have a loop of memories just free-flowing all the time.
So simultaneously, the calendar of the past is going through. And details like what you had for lunch?
Well, I can remember that. But that's, I mean, it just
Pick
could
a
be
day
anything.
and tell me something you remember for lunch.
May 27th, 2006.
What'd you have?
I had a BLT and a tomato soup.
Well, I want to tell everybody that this can be checked if you think it's just random. Show the journals up here, if you will, everyone. Jill has kept 50,000 pages of journals every day of her life. Scientists say even if you wanted to memorize them, you couldn't memorize them. You can go back and check, and as you'll see tonight, you even remember hairspray incidents and what day they occurred on in what year. Does this mean you were good in school?
I was not good in school.
See, this is inconceivable. You didn't have the ability to take a poem and then suddenly recall it?
My memory is autobiographical, so I could tell you my life, but to memorize a poem or a monologue was very excruciating for me.
Which raises this whole question that we have talked about a lot, which is we all think it would be bliss to be able to remember every day of our lives. Is it more of a comfort or a burden?
It's both.
Tell me about the burden. Tell me about what it is to be able to remember every single painful incident in your life.
It's horrendous.
Small things.
Everything. Yeah, regrets, choices. I mean, I could literally go back to the exact moment I was in that fork in the road where I could have made this choice, but I made this choice, and then that leads to this, which leads to that, and I just can't forget that.
So contrary to all of us who can maybe remember 365 days of whole periods of our lives, you remember 365 a year. And does this mean that you actually get trapped in time? Like something in amber?
My head.
You travel in your head.
That's what I call it.
Everyone thinks, again, you could take this ability, go on Jeopardy and earn a lot of money.
I could if it were stuff that I was interested in.
But it has to be things that you were interested in because it's about your
Because I relate it to where I was and what was going on in my life. Like that's like the Princess Grace thing.
The Princess Grace moment tonight when I thought I had it right, and by the way, the book has it wrong. A question about those around you. Has anybody come up with anything, the scientists yet, that has helped you file it away, file the memory away?
No. I don't think they ever can, because it's my brain, so how can they? You can't make your brain stop. So I don't, unless, I mean, short of a lobotomy, I don't really think that there's anything that can be done for me.
Good things just got better. Introducing an all-new third hour of Good Morning America.
Welcome to Good Morning America Now.
Good Morning America Now. Good Morning America Now.
On ABC News Now. Get your Good Morning America now at abcnewsnow.com.
So Jill Price, kind of a extraordinary example. I'm going to briefly talk about these two different types of amnesia. They're pretty straightforward and pretty definitional. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty behind them. But these are types of memory loss that somebody could potentially have. There's retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. Retrograde, think like old school, but like retro, in the past. Retrograde amnesia refers to an inability to retrieve memories of the past, right? You might have a stroke or a brain bleed or some other sort of brain damage that makes it so you can't remember what's happened in your past. Think like, what's that movie with Rachel McAdams? She gets in a car crash and she can't remember. I can't remember. Think that movie, if you've seen it. But she gets in a car crash and she like wakes up and she doesn't remember her husband. She doesn't remember like her wedding day or like what she does for a living and all that good stuff. But she can create new memories, which is different from anterograde amnesia, which is people who cannot form new long-term memories. So people who might have some sort of brain damage that disallows them from like creating new memories. You may remember everything up until your accident, but you can't remember anything after that accident. If you've seen the movie Memento, that would be an example of anterograde amnesia. So these are just two types of like diagnoses as they pertain to forgetting that you're just going to have to kind of know the difference between. With that, I want you to take a second and I want you to look at these pennies. Well, pretty abrupt transition, regardless. Look at these pennies and I want you to tell me which of these has the design of an actual US cent. All right, so the answer is actually this one. And this is kind of a retrieval and a recognition test, right? In terms of retrieval, the question is what words, numbers, and which locations are the front of a US cent coin? This should be easy because, well, you don't read the textbook, but it was in the textbook. And when we're talking about retrieval, you know that these all look like a penny, right? But recognition, choose the correct design among these pictures, right? If you had to recall it, I would be asking you to like draw me a picture of a cent, whereas this is an example of recognition in which you have kind of a multiple choice, which of these is a good example. And so with that in mind, a couple of reasons why you may not have picked the correct penny in this example, right? You may have gone through an encoding failure, right? If you're looking here, you have this external event, you have a sensory memory, right? You see a coin, you pay attention to it, or you maybe don't pay attention to it, right? And it goes into your working memory. I know that's a penny, right? And maybe our understanding of a penny is that it's like small, skinny, and bronze, right? It's not silver like some of the other coins. And so therefore, we don't think about the actual detail on the penny and we undergo an encoding failure and what that penny actually looks like and which direction the head is facing and where the date is, like doesn't go into our long-term memory, right? Anyway, the question is, why do we fail to retrieve the information, right? It's maybe because we never paid attention to the details, or we may have once looked at a penny and paid attention to it, but we didn't rehearse it, so we never encoded it into our long-term memory, right? Another reason why we may have forgotten which penny was correct, right, is storage decay, right? And material encoded into long-term memory will decay if the memory is never used, recalled, or restored. Decay in our long-term memory can be seen from this graph. Wow, I got very distracted right then. Here we see that the fact that decay actually seems to like level off-ish because we tend to remember something or like really study for like a Spanish test in this example, right? Like, and we remember all of our conjugations and all the vocab and like all the grammatical pieces and how to verbalize that. But then like in a short time after, we start to forget that, and then we really only remember the stuff that we practice time and time again, right? So yeah, we're going to look at then a video that looks at the tip of the tongue phenomenon. If you've ever been like, oh, I know this, it's right there, it's right in the front of my brain, but you just can't remember, right? That is a very widely studied phenomenon in psychology, and this video is going to give you a little bit of insight into why that is. The reason that we're talking about it right here, right, it's retrieval. It's our inability to remember something. We're forgetting something. We can't produce information that we feel we should be able to produce. So here's one piece of the puzzle as it pertains to forgetting.
We all know it, the intense frustration, the deep self-loathing when a word is stuck. It's right on the tip of your tongue. Researchers have been studying this phenomenon since the 1960s, hoping for some relief, and finally, thanks to science, we have salvation. The words presque vu, meaning almost seen, describe that thing where you can almost say a word, you're positive you know it, and if I just give you like half a second, you'd be able to say it, but no, you totally never get it. And the French term provides a nice dose of always appreciated culture, and I use it because the English one doesn't exist. Not because I can't think of it, it's just we don't have a word for it. According to researchers, tip of the tongue states, or tots, happen all the time, an infuriating once a week for most of us, which increases to about once daily as we age. They span most languages, from Arabic to Afrikaans, and in the worst cases they're accompanied by blockers, or so-called ugly sisters. Like when you're trying to think of Van Gogh, and all you can think of is Vin Diesel. To understand tip of the tongue states, scientists combine theories in neuroscience and computer science into what's known as connectionist models. These describe the ways we can use computers to simulate how neurons in our brains handle language. In these models, the brain is represented as a network of connected nodes, processing centers that are kind of like individual computers. Even though the connectionist models describe things in terms of networks and nodes, they're a lot like how our brains actually work. In 1949, a psychologist named Donald Hebb proposed a theory to explain how neurons in the brain change through experience to encode new information. It's how we learn. In both connectionist models and neuroscience, as you have a thought, particular clusters of neurons or nodes are activated, meaning they start sending signals to each other. Activation then spreads from higher, more complex clusters to lower ones in patterns that seem unpredictable at first, but after a while, it's not unpredictable at all. Activating certain clusters when you have a thought actually physically changes the connections between them, making it more likely they'll activate together again. It's like a path in the woods. The more it's used, the more defined the path gets. And while learning is all well and good, it doesn't mean much if you can't cough up all the knowy good stuff when it comes time to. Retrieving the knowledge starts at the highest level clusters, the one containing semantic or meaning information. Then the activation spreads down to the lowest level clusters containing phonological or sound information. So say you want to talk about King Arthur's sword. First, a higher level cluster would light up, and that would spread down to the clusters for each sound in Excalibur. A tip of the tongue state is what happens when the meaning clusters light up, but the sound clusters don't activate completely, because the signal in your brain takes a detour instead of following the right path. That's why you can often describe characteristics of the word and not the whole word itself. It's like, it starts with S, or it rhymes with Snortzenbagger when you're trying to remember who played the Terminator. Actually, I was playing a game with my mom recently, and she was trying to think of Uma Thurman, and she said Erna Thulman, which I'm never gonna let her live that down. And as it turns out, having someone tell you the word is probably doing more harm than good. In something the researchers call the resolution effect, coming to the word yourself makes it more likely that your brain will reinforce the correct pathway from meaning to sound activation. So the next time someone asks you to help them with a word, you might want to look them in the eye and say, no. You're never gonna learn that way. But there are other ways to help them. Researchers have found that giving a person in a TOT state a hint about the word, for example like Arn, if you're going for Arnold Schwarzenegger, helps them establish the right connections in their brain. And then next time it'll be easier for them to come up with the word or the person's name on their own. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, which was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you want to help support this show so we can keep making more of them and making them better so that you will enjoy them and enjoy them more and watch more and share them with all your friends and seem like a really smart person, you could go to patreon.com/scishow. And if you just want to keep watching them, go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
So there's the tip of the tongue phenomenon. This slide I actually just took from the textbook slide because I want to talk about the difference between proactive interference and retroactive interference because you have to know them. But I want to just kind of breeze over it pretty quickly. So take a second, read through this slide. I'll talk about, you just pause it, read through it, jot down any ideas that you think are important, and then I'll talk about proactive and on the next slide, retroactive interference. So proactive interference occurs when past information interferes with learning new information. So that's something like, I remember when I was in high school, my mom taught AP Stats, but I wasn't in her class, and like every time she tried to help me with my homework, I'd be like, well, that's not how Mr. Breen taught me, right? And so like how Mr. Breen taught it and like the methodology that he used made it very difficult for me to learn a different method of approaching a AP Stats written problem or whatever, right? You may have strong memories of previous principle. This memory makes it difficult to learn the new principle's name, right? You had to change email passwords, but you keep trying the old one and you can't seem to memorize the new one. You may have grown up within a society with everything going on in the world today, with all of the Black Lives Matter protests and all of the riots and the police brutality that we've been kind of exposed to on a greater scale within the last couple of weeks, right? Think about proactive interference, right? Many people have been living their lives in a certain way, whether you are Black or white or Indian or Hispanic or Asian, whatever you might identify as, right? You've experienced the world in a certain way. And because of that learning and how you've learned to interact with your world and what is expected of you, right? It's really difficult to start a conversation about race, especially when it pertains to people who have white privilege. It can be very, very difficult for people to talk about and learn other perspectives and how to better engage in a actively anti-racist way within society. This is just kind of me talking about like current events and connecting it back to psychology. So obviously there's like a lot more to this conversation, but I do think it's important to recognize the like greater ramifications that something like proactive interference in memory can in fact have on like a more societal and large scale way and impact. So with that kind of heavy note, I'm going to shift and look at retrograde amnesia here, or sorry, retrograde interference. Oh, retroactive interference, Sarah, get it? So we'll talk retroactive, look at a summary, and then watch one last video of the misinformation effect. So retroactive interference occurs when new stimuli or learning interferes with the storage or retrieval of previously formed memories, right? One study, students who studied right before 8 hours of sleep had better recall than those who studied before 8 hours of daily activity. So studying at night was more beneficial than studying right away in the morning, because if you studied in the morning, you had to do a bunch of stuff. You had to maybe you were studying for psychology, and then you had to go to math, and then you had to go to gym, and then you had to go to AP Lang, and then you went to psychology, and all of that other brain activity made it difficult to remember what you had studied right away in the morning for psychology, right? The daily activities retroactively interfered with the morning's learning. So you have this idea of proactive interference, past experiences, interfering with creating new memories, and then you have retroactive new experiences, making it difficult to remember old understandings. With that, then, here's our little summary. We have our sensory memory that has, right, you see here, a lot of dots, a lot of information bits. And as it goes into our working memory, we see less dots, less information, right? And then long term, we even know even more. And then being able to retrieve that, we know even fewer little information bits. So forgetting can occur at any memory stage. As we process information, we filter, alter, or lose much of it. And that's why the relearning process is so important. The last slide here, I just kind of added this on because there was a whole list of things that the textbook said you needed to know about, like specific instances of forgetting that aren't really all that important. So I just wanted to reference this one specifically because you will need to know it. And I'm actually going to let the video speak more to it. I just have this image here so that if you want to write down some ideas, you are more than welcome to. So we'll watch this video. That'll be the last thing that we do for this lecture, for our very last lecture. Okay, the misinformation effect. Here you go.
Hold on. Have you done this before? What about this? It's only human to want to capture memories. That doesn't mean that's how our memory actually works. In fact, there's more than one kind of memory. When we talk about memories of events, we're talking about episodic memory. We create episodic memories by encoding sensory information from the world into our brains. These become memory traces, which are stored until they are retrieved, a fancy word for remembering. However, you don't remember things exactly as they were. Memory is constructive. Each time you remember a memory, you're actually rebuilding it using those memory traces and your own guesswork. That's why psychologist Elizabeth Loftus compares memory to a Wikipedia page. You can edit it, but that means other people can too. And they're not always right. When a memory is distorted by wrong information before it's retrieved, this is known as the misinformation effect. Literally hundreds of studies have shown the misinformation effect. In one study, Loftus and her colleagues showed people slides of a car accident. Then, they asked the participants questions about the scene. Some were given a question with misleading information that mentions a yield instead of a stop sign, while some saw a question with consistent information. Later, those who were misinformed were about 20% more likely to incorrectly report that they saw a yield sign compared to those who received the correct information. Taken to the extreme, misinformation can send an innocent person to jail. You wouldn't want to be in a police lineup with a misinformed eyewitness. Eyewitness memory is easily distorted if there are suggestive police procedures. For example, if a police officer unintentionally implies that the crook is in the lineup. When witnesses talk to each other, they also share information that might not be true. Despite this, many jurors and judges are convinced that eyewitness evidence is the most persuasive kind of evidence out there. This has serious consequences. Out of the 314 prisoners who have since been proven innocent, almost 3 out of 4 were mistakenly identified by an eyewitness. Although no one is immune to the misinformation effect, young children and the elderly are the most prone to it. In addition, the effects are strongest after a long period of time, when the memory trace becomes so weak that we rely almost entirely on external information to reconstruct the memory. So go ahead and take a picture. It'll last longer and it'll be more accurate. Well, mostly.
And there you have it. You are now done with all of your psychology lectures. Congratulations. Yay, you. Happy Tuesday. Tuesday's kind of a dumb day. But Thursday is the last day of school. So that's exciting. It's almost summertime. Yay!